The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is our monthly episode 4, where we get to ask our speaker all the questions that we've gotten from our episodes for the month so far. And by the way, thanks for all your questions and feedback. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is your host, Paul Wirkus. We're fortunate this month to be able to spend some time talking about, I think, a very, very important subject and trying to untangle some of the issues related to this. So we're very fortunate this month to have Megan Jensen back with us, as well as Nicole Holland. Megan is the lead of the Intermountain Eating Disorders Leadership Team, and Nicole is an intern in that program, in a master's program from the University of New England. Welcome to both of you.
Hello, super happy to be back.
Here's the weird thing, Megan. I was thinking we had last talked like 6 months ago, and then I was looking through my notes, and it was 2 years ago. There have been so many things that I took away from that, and so many more questions that I wanted to ask. That I am so thankful that you're willing to take a little while this month to help educate me. Because again, if you can educate me, you can educate anyone, is the format of this program. Before we dive in today, are there any disclosures that either of you have that we need to talk about?
Nothing comes to mind.
Nicole, any side hustles you need to talk about?
Nope. This is it.
This is all just education. Okay, great. So we're talking again about eating disorders, and I think it's such a fascinating topic because it's at the heart of so many things that we talk about. I've alluded before on the podcast to an article actually I read by a psychologist in the Washington Post a year or so ago, where she talked about the things that give parents the most anxiety when their children are young are things with high stakes and low control. So sleeping, eating, and toileting. And it turns out that in the process, one of the anxieties then is we want to give our children healthy eating habits for the rest of their life. And in an eating disorders clinic, you spend a lot of time trying to untangle what feel like a pathologic approach to eating. Am I representing that fairly?
Yes, for sure. We spend a lot of time talking about what eating and feeding was like growing up. And I think a lot of times there's so much pressure on parents to develop healthy eating habits that sometimes it can be harmful unintentionally, but sometimes it can be harmful in the effort to be healthy.
And, I think that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from, is that people want to do a good job and recognize the stakes are high. And so it increases the anxiety. And I think that not only do we want to nourish children, we want to give them a pattern for the rest of their life that doesn't become harmful. Just for the sake of the discussion, do you want to give us a brief definition of eating disorders? We spent much more time on this a couple of years ago, but just an overview of things that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. So there's a couple different kind of thresholds here where we have disordered eating and then there's an eating disorder. And they are similar in a lot of ways, but definitely distinctly different. With eating disorders being a diagnosable psychiatric condition. So there are specific criteria that need to be met out of the DSM-5 for those in the psychology realm. And that can be anything from we restrict food heavily. We have compensatory mechanisms for eating, such as intentional vomiting, known as purging, laxative use, excessive exercise. There's binging, more of kind of out of control eating. Disordered eating encompasses a lot of those things, but basically just not to the extent that it's diagnosable as an eating disorder. The descriptions for the diagnoses usually include very specific, like frequency, intensity, and other medical effects of what's going on because of the intensity of the behaviors.
In looking at both eating disorders and disordered eating, it would seem that if there's a way to prevent them, that's at the heart of what we're trying to do. Is that a mistaken notion?
Absolutely not. They're easier to prevent than they are to treat. So trust me on that one.
And this is where I think it gets very tricky in my perspective, and that's early recognition of disordered eating, because I think we find ourselves in a tension between trying to decrease anxiety with reassurance, but also to keep a sensitivity so that we don't miss things that are headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Early recognition is important. Some of the disordered eating before it becomes an eating disorder, if we can recognize it then we're in a much better spot
What are some of the risk
for
factors
sure.
for disordered eating?
There are there are a lot. And Nicole, definitely tell me if I'm missing one because I sometimes I think the big ones we think of are like genetics. There's definitely a genetic predisposition. The whole like nature versus nurture, like both are impactful for sure in this situation. And then life experiences, trauma, and other mental health disorders have a huge overlap. Nicole, what ones am I missing?
Honestly, I think one of the hardest things about eating disorders, the risk factors are so vast. They affect everyone. They affect females, males, young, old, socioeconomic classes. It doesn't discriminate. And there's a genetic component for sure, but there's also related to personality types. There's perfectionism, a lot of type A personalities, but at the same time, on the flip side, it really is such a wild card. I think there's exposure factors, like Megan talked about, related to trauma and trying to control our environment. I honestly, in my experience, haven't seen a single risk factor that's like, okay, this is going to lead to an eating disorder. It really is just so vast that it's hard to nail down, like, oh, this is going to lead to an eating disorder because there's so many different outcomes that can lead to that.
Absolutely.
It seems like one of the things that's very difficult is we tend to be very body type sensitive from a very early age. And there are some kids who end up either getting stereotyped or worse yet teased about their body habits, about who they are. How does that feed into the issue of disordered eating?
It impacts things very significantly. The current research from NEDA, which is the National Eating Disorder Association, they talk about how those that are I usually use the term like in larger
Hmm.
bodies or in larger body habitus. They are between 2.5 and 3 times more likely to have an eating disorder. However, they are only diagnosed at about half the rate of those that are in smaller bodies or in normal sized, average sized bodies. And so there's definitely a huge component there. You know, teasing and bullying are very common in this population. Another thing that I see commonly is in a provider or parents get worried really at a young age of a kiddo's body size, usually before even puberty. So we don't really even know, right, what their body size is going to be once they go through puberty and develop and things and get taller and all that. But oftentimes they are prescribed basically diets, right? Maybe that's not the word that the provider or the parent uses to describe what they're doing, but basically put on diets and dieting is also a risk factor. And the longer someone diets, you know, especially if it starts at a young age, increases the risk of developing an eating disorder at some point even greater.
And it seems like one of the biggest challenges is when there's a variety of body types in a single family, that often one child will be singled out for different treatment because of a different body type.
Yeah, we see that a lot. I mean, I don't know what you're thinking, Nicole, but I think of like probably a handful of patients that we meet with, right?
Yeah.
That they're exactly in that situation where they were treated differently because of their body size. And even now, as they are growing into adults, their family or, you know, just social circle treats them differently, even though their body size could be directly associated with the comments that were made and the decisions that were made about diet and lifestyle from a young age, and that now has resulted in generally even a larger body size.
Yeah. I think just more awareness for parents about the genetic aspect of body weight, that there isn't a singular body type in a family. Because, like Megan said, we have clients that are 60, 70 years old plus now that refer back to parental comments about their body weight and size and how that's impacted their eating throughout their life. So there's definitely a strong tie to parents' comments, well-meaning or not, and just either not knowing what to say or trying to develop a body shape and size that they feel is appropriate for that child.
Let's start with some principles this week. What are some things that we can do, some principles that help encourage healthy eating patterns? What sorts of things can we, in some ways, generalize among families for best approach to eating healthy? Because I think one of our temptations often is stuck in terms of good foods and bad foods. How should I deal with that?
I think a very common concern. I can't sit here as a dietitian and be like, every single food has the same nutrition content,
Sure.
because we know that that's absolutely
Right,
not
right,
true.
right.
Right. And there's definitely foods that we want to eat more often or in higher quantities than others. I often will recommend to parents and families to really kind of take a step back. Let's not label foods, because if we're putting a moral label on a food, good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, then we're kind of putting foods on pedestals,
Mhm.
right? I was even talking to my brother about this the other day, and he has little kids, toddler age and younger, and we were talking about nutrition because one of them is struggling with some nutrition related issues. And I just kind of said this, like, let's not label foods as healthy or unhealthy. Let's not make food as a reward, right? Because it just kind of puts into, once again, foods are on pedestals and we have to earn food. And he was kind of like, well, why? I want her to eat healthy. Okay, like let's talk about that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Like let's unpack this. What does healthy mean? And I spend a lot of time with parents and families and patients talking about this idea of balance. And all foods fit, some more often than others, but that really the health comes in this overall balance over weeks and months with nutrition.
Nicole, anything you want to add to that?
I have two little boys. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. So trying to battle as a parent solid nutrition habits. One thing that I have found in talking to them, I was shocked a couple months ago. My 6-year-old, so in first grade, came home and said a comment along the lines of one of his friends at school had talked about calories being bad for you as a first grader. And so there was this moment of like, oh no, like we're already starting this discussion. He's young and he's not aware of body shape and size yet. He's just living his best life. But I tried an approach of using a metaphor that they could understand, like yellow, green, and red light, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
choosing foods that are green light foods the majority of the time, but there's still space for our yellow. And the red things are the things that will hurt our body. So things that we don't want to eat that would hurt us, like taking too much medicine or things like that. But the primary component of focusing on the green, there's a time and a place to have the yellow foods. There's a component of foods that goes beyond just nutritional value. There's a social component of foods. There's, when you go to a birthday and you all gather around and sing happy birthday, no one's really thinking about the nutritional content. It's the social celebration and the aspect of food that I think we have to recognize. And if we don't talk about that or ignore that, that doesn't set up a healthy mindset for food either, I believe. So just primarily focusing on that green light and then also allowing space though for those times of celebration or those times with our yellow lights as well. And like Megan said, not in a good or bad way, but trying to develop those habits around primarily green and then our yellow as well, adding in.
We hear sometimes about intuitive eating. What does that mean, and does it make sense?
Yeah, intuitive eating is I feel like it's a hot button topic, because that's not necessarily, at least it is in my world, but I do this every day,
Yeah,
every day.
my
So,
world too. So
um,
World too, though, because we talk all the time about what kids are eating and how to help them to stay healthy.
yeah, I think there's obviously exceptions, right? But the vast majority of children are born with this innate ability to eat intuitively, in the sense of they are very much in tune with their body's cues and signals of hunger, of fullness, of eating foods that they enjoy. I mean, try to give a toddler a food that they don't enjoy and you'll hear
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
You will know for sure that they do not enjoy that food. Obviously, that comes with time and things to develop a wider palate. But kind of on the flip side, though, so we have these natural abilities that we're born with to recognize these cues. But on the flip side, learning to eat is hard. It's one of the hardest things that someone will learn to do, because it involves gross motor skills, fine motor skills. All the senses are involved, which can be very overwhelming. And so the intuitive things that we are born with. As we learn how to eat, as we grow up in households with adults that may or may not be in tune with their cues, it kind of goes away, right? And we kind of go through periods of time where we may not be eating intuitively, may not necessarily know that that's not what's happening, but really trying to be effective in continuing the development of intuitive eating. And this involves parents needing to be intuitive eaters as well, learning to recognize hunger cues, learning to recognize fullness cues, but also honor their kiddos' cues because their body will know what it needs, and not trying to force feed or eating certain foods that they don't like. We don't want the dinner table to be a high pressure, really anxiety driven situation because that will only lead to problems as time goes on.
One of the questions that I get asked very frequently that has been very striking to me is that people will say, ever since we started feeding her solid foods, she's not drinking as much milk. And the response I often have to that is babies are better at managing calories than I am. That babies tend to be more calorie sensitive. And it turns out that I can eat more calories because food is delicious and I can muscle past it. Is that what you're talking about? The intuitive.
Yeah, for sure. They really good at really telling you that we've had enough. And I think adults, we're always on the run. We are trying to manage ourselves as well as little humans, and all
Yeah.
of these things are hard. And really noticing hunger cues and fullness cues take time, and they require a little bit of mindfulness. I have two fur babies, so I don't have human babies yet. But Nicole, how do you manage that with your knowledge and background in dietetics? Like, how do you manage intuitive eating as an adult while also trying to develop with your kiddos?
Yeah, yeah. I think honestly, one of the most amazing things as a parent and nutritionally wise is seeing your kids actually do it. I think the main job as a parent is to provide the environment, similar to like a lot of different life skills, right? Like it's not our job to force them to learn different things, but to provide the environment and structure to learn those things. So providing a variety of foods and providing foods that are going to help their bodies be healthy and strong, and talking about foods in a balanced way. So it's not ever restricting, like never allowing the sweets and the things like that, but providing a structure and a balance of here is a dinner table full of a variety of different foods, and then allowing them to choose and feed themselves. So you're not portioning out for them or talking to them. I think as we age, there are just so many messages to us about foods, and whether that's a certain type of food, carbohydrates, for example, are bad, so we're going to restrict those all the way. We are taught to ignore our hunger and fullness cues. And so, as a parent, honoring those cues for your kids and saying if they eat half their plate and they're done, that's okay. I think it's okay to let kids walk away from the table without finishing their plate.
To your earlier point, Nicole, one of the things that I think is challenging sometimes is I think we recognize that many foods that are cheap and convenient are yellow light foods, more highly processed and processed in a way that doesn't enhance their nutritional value. And I realize I'm stepping on thin ice there with value because, again, I'm trying to define things as not good and bad, but good and bad. So, how do you guide parents through that? Because much of what's convenient and affordable, it becomes more and more yellow light driven.
Yeah, this is a big one. Megan, jump in anytime. I'll take a stab at it and then let Megan take over. I didn't know if this was going to be a parenting podcast. Yeah, that's true. I think there is truth in that, but I think there's also some fallacy in that.
Okay.
I do think there's a lot of convenient foods, and again, not trying to tread lightly on the nutritional value, right? That fit in, but that also we want to incorporate on a less basis than like a green light food. I also do believe though that there's a lot of really nutritionally sound, our basis of fruits and veggies and our fresh foods that are our green light foods. You can go to the store and grab an apple just as easily as you can grab any other more processed food. And so I think part of it is true, but also there's just some education on parent side of what we can make in a quick and healthy way. And I think there's also some fallacy to this idea that to have a healthy meal, you have to take an hour to prepare a full 4-course dinner. And I don't think that's necessarily true either. You can make homemade pizzas in 10 minutes with your kiddos,
Hmm.
and that can be a healthy balanced meal as well. So there is truth to it, but I also think that recognition of there are convenient options that are just as healthy and just as convenient if we take the time to educate ourselves. And that is the hard part as a parent, is being educated enough to provide those meals and foods.
Some feedback that I get from a lot of patients nowadays is things are expensive. Like rising food costs, even every time I go to the store and I'm just shopping for two people and two dogs, right? The final total comes and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, like that
Yeah.
painful,
Right.
right? As parents, we're trying to feed balanced meals, but we can't ignore that processed foods tend to be less expensive. And so, one thing I really try to emphasize with parents is number one, fed is best. If it's the difference between we're not eating or we're eating a processed food,
Sure.
great, right? Fed is best. But also trying to have variety as much as we can. One way that I describe this concept to parents is imagine that we're building a house, and the house is a representation of our body. And we have bricks, and we have wood, and we have cement, and we have nails, and all these things are different nutrients. And so if I am only having carbs, and let's say carbs are bricks, I can build a really cool tower, a really big tower, but I can't really make it into a house. And so it's kind of where that variety component comes in. Generally, carbohydrate rich processed foods are going to be the cheapest ones, just in general. But could we add in some canned or frozen fruits or
Yeah.
vegetables, right? Because those are generally cheaper, they're just as nutritious. And so maybe we have a canned fruit or vegetable on the side with whatever carbohydrate rich food we have. And, maybe we look at these fruits and vegetables with their variety of nutrients as other materials to build the house. And we're not going to have all the materials every single day to build a house. But over time, this talk about balance and variety, it's over time we will. And we don't build houses in a day. So lots of time and effort. And that's where that balance component comes in. At times, we're going to have more variety than other times as income fluctuates, as I'm going out of town here for a few weeks overseas, and that's going to look rather different than me being at home, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that because, as Nicole touched on earlier, there are lots of different reasons why we eat food, and the nutrition content is one of them, but connection with people we love, foods being comforting, memory building. When I think of at my home, I'm actually going to visit my parents this weekend, and I think of like walking in the house, coming home from college, and I'm smelling my mom's molasses crinkle cookies,
Hmm.
right? It's never like, whenever I think of home, I think of salad,
Right.
like that's
Right.
not,
Right.
I've never once thought, not, but I think of these other things that were common growing up that we loved and that were important. And so if we're in a situation where maybe we can't always afford what we perceive as well balanced, that's okay. Because can we also build connection and memories with our family if we're unable to maybe afford what we would prefer? That is also very important for long-term health, even if it's not all the materials to build a house. Hopefully I explained
No,
that
that's.
okay.
I think it's very helpful. One last point for the week, and that's how about using food as a punishment or a reward?
Using it as a reward or punishment, kind of going back to the putting a value on it, that can be a tricky component because then if it's used as a punishment, if we're withholding food, that's a whole different game. But if we are using food as a reward, you're placing it on a higher value, and that can get dangerous because then down the line we're associating. It's such a hard thing with nutrition because there's a balance of everything. It's never going to be black or white. It's not, food can never be used as a celebration, but we have to be careful of putting a value on it.
Like there's even a double whammy built into it, right? If you eat everything on your plate, then you can have a treat. When actually
Yeah.
everything on the plate may not be the right portion. Sometimes the portion that we give a child is the wrong portion. And the intuitive eating you were talking about earlier, I guess what you're trying to avoid is this notion that I'm done so that I can have this other food instead, is what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah.
It feels like rewarding overeating with something else may not be the right message.
Yeah, and one thing that we commonly see with our patients is that if food is used as a reward or if it's withheld because of XYZ, usually it's like didn't finish our plate. Eventually, the kiddo's going to eat it. They're going to find a way. And usually it involves sneaking and hiding food. And then there's all the guilt and the shame that comes with
Right.
that because they feel that they shouldn't be doing these things. And oftentimes that leads right into disordered eating and potentially an eating disorder as time goes on.
Yeah.
Well,
I think there's a scarcity mindset component to it that I think a lot of people are comfortable with when we talk about money. We know in the Great Depression, after that, there was this rise of like scarcity mindset. If something was withheld from you, the next time you have it, you want all of it. And I think that applies in food and nutrition as well. If we withhold food from kids, they don't develop a healthy relationship with it. And the next time it is available to them, they will tend to grab everything they can because in their mind, they don't know when they're going to get it again. So I think the scarcity mindset applies in taking it from a environment that we see it with like money and something we're more comfortable with talking about sometimes and over to like a food can be helpful too.
very helpful. Before we finish, you folks are both involved in a program, the Boulder Way Forward. Do you want to mention the Boulder Way Forward?
This is a wonderful program out of Utah State University. And the goal of this program is to decrease the inequities between men and women in the state of Utah across the lifespan. So, including kiddos up until old age. And we are part of the section that is about health across the lifespan. And then there's a subsection, there's lots of little sections here about eating disorders. And so, our goal here over presenting and talking with you guys over the next couple episodes is to really try to focus on decreasing these gaps, on focusing on prevention, and really just try to increase awareness about eating disorders in the community in general.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for your time and your insight this week. To our listeners, I'm sure you'll have questions. Please send your questions to questions@vcurb.com. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that tend to also have an impact on the development of eating disorders, and we will try to do our best to untangle that. Megan and Nicole, thanks again for being with us. I hope you're willing to come back next week.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be there.
See you then.
Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Production design, thanks to Wirkus, who also composed the theme music. See you next time.